Recording stopped. And we're back again. We're going to then look at what happens during the transition period as we're moving from the old Forest Stewardship Standard to the new one. At that point, we'll stop and have a little bit of time for some questions, and then move into an overview of some of the more significant changes between version 1 and version 2 of the standard. Couple of things I want to make sure everyone understands. First of all, we are recording the webinar today, and it will be made available publicly, including the question and answer periods. We're going to ask if you would please submit questions via the chat. This is really to help us with documentation. It will help us develop frequently asked question documents. It will help us to know what we need to focus on in future webinars and other events. If you really want to ask something verbally, you can put up your hand during one of those question answer periods and we'll call on you, but it would be great if you could put questions in the chat. We're going to stop after agenda item number 2, and then again when we get to number 4 for questions. Let's see. I also wanted to make sure that we were clear that this is going to be the same basic agenda as tomorrow. So we've got 2 webinars. This one's intended to provide a little bit of a higher level overview. And then tomorrow, we're going to be diving into the weeds and getting into some more details, particularly in this 3rd section on significant changes. So Carly and I will take absolutely no offense if anyone decides that they don't want to attend both webinars today and tomorrow. If you want to just wait for tomorrow, feel free to leave. No offense taken, not a problem at all. Okay. With that, I think we can get moving. Okay, so before going any further, I just want to take a minute to thank absolutely everyone who has been involved in this process. I mean, and this means hundreds of people have been part of this over the last many years. We had a technical working group. We have had a large number of board members who are some still there and some are past board members who were part of our standard development group, former staff members, people who participated in the consultations, people who attended previous webinars or were part of forums that we held, and also those of you who have been providing ongoing peer support and kind of mental sanity support throughout the entire process. For those of us with FSC US, I just really want to thank you for being part of this and, you know, working together to make this the best product that we can. So just wanted to start there. So I want to actually back up just a little bit. And the first is to look at our FSC US mission is to provide pathways for people to support and recognize responsible forest management. And this is in support itself of our global mission, FSC mission, which is to promote environmentally appropriate, socially beneficial, and economically viable management of the world's forests. And one of the core ways we do this is through our forest management certification. This is really how we get to defining and determining and measuring responsible forest management. And forest management certification is completed via Forest Stewardship Standards. So this is why this revision process has been so important and is really at the core of what we do as FSC US. So all Forest Stewardship Standards are based on the same framework of principles and criteria. And the FSC principles and criteria are determined by our members. We're a member-led organization, and it's our members who say, yes, this is how we're going to define responsible forest management. The last time the principles and criteria were revised, they were finalized as version 5, and that was in 2012. And since that time, all of the forest stewardship standards that are new or have been revised have been based on that version 5 set of principles and criteria. The international generic indicators that are listed there on the left were introduced in 2015 as a way of providing a starting point for the development of indicators within each criterion. And it's a way to say, if you're going to think about what really needs to be done to achieve this criterion, here's a set of indicators, generically applicable, hopefully globally, that could be used to get you started. So standard developers at either a regional or national scale then take this global framework of principles and criteria and international generic indicators, and then look at them and say, okay, so how's this going to work in our local context, whether it's a regional or national scale? And then those indicators can be adapted so that they use terminology that's more applicable for the local context, or reflect management systems that are more regularly used in the local context. So the indicators then get adapted to a local context. In the US context, we already had some indicators in our previous standard. So we also looked at those because we knew that those had already been adapted to the local context. But that's how the framework works. So we have a global framework that's consistent and then locally adapted indicators. There are now over 100 regional or national level forest stewardship standards within the FSC system. This is version 2 for the United States. Version 1 of the US Forest Stewardship Standard was published in 2010, so it's been a little while since then. And not surprisingly, there's been a fair number of changes that we've made within the standard. Okay. All right, so our process started basically in about 2018. At that time, our FSC US Board of Directors took on the responsibility of being the standard development group. We went through 2 public consultations. Thousands of comments were submitted. The standard development group looked at those, looked at changes that might be needed as a result of those comments. And we went through 3 drafts, with the final one being submitted to FSC International for consideration. We got back comments from them. We went through a large number of back and forths. Additional changes were made to address concerns and comments from the FSC International perspective. And then we submitted again for a final review. We went through a couple of additional rounds of revision after that. But earlier this year in July, our draft 6 document was approved, fully approved. And we're really, really excited to be able to share some of the information about that. So we now have a fully approved Forest Stewardship Standard, version 2 for the United States. Okay, so now that we've got it developed and done, we need to look at how are we going to support certificate holders and other stakeholders in the transition to this new or revised standard. Okay, the formal version, the official version of the new standard will be published on January 1. I'll get to it in a minute, but we have an unofficial version available for anyone to look at who wishes to do so. But the official version, the one that will be used for auditors, will be published on January 1. The transition period begins on April 1 of 2026, and then the transition period ends on September 30th of 2027. So the transition period is 18 months long, and during that period of time, the standards overlap. Both of them are valid during this transition period. The new one becomes effective at the beginning of the transition period. The old one is no longer valid for audits at the end of the transition period. And for some reason, my slides are not advancing. There they are. Okay, so what happens during the transition period? First of all, I want to emphasize for any certificate holders who might be on the call, your normal audit cycle and your schedule will continue as you've been doing it, unless you choose to make a change. So that means that if you were scheduled to have a surveillance audit during the transition period, then you'll have a surveillance audit. If you were scheduled to have a recertification audit, then you would have a recertification audit. You can keep the same kind of normal time of the year when you have your audit, unless you choose to make changes or shift that, and you would need to work with your certification body on that, obviously. So as I said a minute ago, both standards are valid for audits during this 18-month time period. So that means it is up to the certificate holder with engagement with their certification body as to whether they wish to have multiple audits during this time, with one first to the old standard and then the second one to the new standard, or whether you just want to move in, whether the certificate holder just wants to go directly to being audited to the revised standard. So there is some flexibility there, and this is helpful, especially if your audit is typically, right at the beginning of the transition period. You don't have to do that audit. You don't have to have your first audit to version 2 right away. However, all certificate holders do have to have an audit to the version 2 standard before the end of the transition period. And additionally, all certificate holders need to be in conformance with the new and revised indicators before the end of the transition period. Okay, so those are the really two key pieces. We are working, there have been some changes in the normative framework recently related to audits and closure of nonconformances, and this has been done to conform with ISO standards. So it has resulted in a little bit of uncertainty, and we're working with our FSC International colleagues to clarify two things in particular. The first is whether or not major nonconformances need to be closed prior to the end of the transition period. This is something that could have an impact on a certificate holder's decision of when they want to have their first version 2 audit, and maybe not so late in the transition period. The second thing we're working on clarifying is whether or not all of the new and revised indicators have to be audited before the end of the transition period, or if the certification bodies have some flexibility, which they've had in the past, to look first at kind of the more important higher risk indicators and then deal with some of the lower risk indicators in subsequent audits, as long as those audits are within the same 5-year certification cycle. All right, so then really quickly, want to let you know that we do have a web page that we are using right now as a consolidated place where we're providing resources to support certificate holders and and other stakeholders during the transition. So you've got the link at the top. We're going to make this webinar recording and the slides available. And so you'll be able to go and look at the different resources that are there and review the webinar also if you so wish. So some of the things that you'll find at this web page are, it's an unofficial draft 6 version of the standard. There's a large number of crosswalks and other kind of high-level comparisons between the old and the revised standards, so that you can look at a kind of big picture or something more detailed. And then before the end of this year, Carly and I are working on providing additional resources via this web page As we confirm dates, there will be a schedule of 2026 engagement events, including a couple of in-person workshops, some virtual workshops, so topic-specific webinars, and other things that may come up that are identified as needs. And so we'll have dates on this webpage as they are confirmed. Carly's working on a set of topic-specific explainers to give a little bit more information and kind of a better, hopefully help for greater understanding around some of the issues that have been identified as more important. We are going to provide some different ways of looking at the standard. There's only one standard that's official and that's used for audits, but for communication purposes, we're going to provide some different ways of looking at the standard. One that's more focused on family forest, one that's more focused perhaps on plantations. And so to help people who have different interests and different needs have something that hopefully will work for them. Also, as I mentioned before, we're going to have a frequently asked questions, and the questions we get from you during this webinar or during tomorrow's webinar or via other kind of communication purposes or approaches, we'll be using those to develop the frequently asked question. Next year, Carly and I will be more focused on those engagement events, and then also working on developing additional tools and resources that have been prioritized by certificate holders. Okay, so I think at this point, I'm going to stop and ask Carly, have there been any questions that have come in via the chat?
We have one question. Could you clarify about non-conformances during the transition period? Those are tied to the new version of the standard, right? That we're not sure about whether or not they need to be closed.
Yes, exactly. In the past, the framework was that the transition period was 12 months long, and then there was kind of a 6-month buffer that was added on at the end, just in case there were major nonconformances that were still open. The old standard would remain valid, so that the certificate holders wouldn't lose their certification. And so that was kind of like a buffer period. It was, you couldn't be audited to the old standard during that time, but it was a time when it was still valid. So the certification could continue to be held while major nonconformances were being resolved. There's been a shift, which is extending the transition period to 18 months and then eliminating that buffer period. For most other normative transitions in the framework, what we're working to understand is whether that also applies to Forest Stewardship Standard transitions. So we don't know yet which way it's going to go. We're going to kind of move forward for now with a working hypothesis that that 6-month buffer will likely not occur, and major nonconformances would need to be resolved before the end of the transition period. But we'll get that clarified before the standard is officially published. So before the end of this year is our goal to get that clarification.
Thank you. We got 2 more questions while you're talking.
Yeah.
One is about will CBs also be going through their own standard transition during the same period, and how could that potentially impact the transition for certificate holders, specifically around corrective actions?
Yeah, so that's what I was just talking about. We're working on resolving that. That standard change that's being referenced, that transition period ends at, I believe, the end of March in 2027. So after March 2027, all of the kind of the timing for nonconformances will be according to the new standard that CBs are using. But prior to the end of March 2027, there will still be some transitioning happening. So it'll be a conversation with the CB to understand exactly the details there. But again, we're trying to work through this in advance. So hopefully everybody will know upfront what the expectations will be and when the change might occur for them. Okay.
Thank you. And we have another question about audit scheduling. So someone's audit is scheduled for the summer and they wondered, do we need to be audited twice during the transition period, or could we be audited only once to the new standard?
So the transition period is 18 months long. For some certificate holders, that might mean that they would only have one audit that would typically occur during the transition period. For some certificate holders, there might be two that would normally be scheduled during that 18-month period, since typically there's an audit every 12 months. Certificate holders could work with their CBs to adjust audit times if that's an option for the CB, if they want to have multiple audits during the transition period, or they don't. The big issue is that every certificate holder has to be audited to the new standard before the end of the transition period. If you happen to have two audits, you can work with your CB. You might want to have the first one to the old standard and the second one to the new standard. There's no requirement to change your audit schedule. So it's just working with your CB to look at your preferences and theirs, as long as you're audited to the new standard at least once before the end of the transition period. So hopefully that was more clear.
Thanks. That's all the questions we have in chat for now.
Awesome. Okay, then we'll move on. So we've got, I think, Carly and I counted, I think we've got about 13 topics that we're going to cover. I will apologize that these slides that are coming are pretty text dense. No pretty pictures, apologies. But not going to cover everything in them. You'll have an opportunity to go back and look at the text if you wish. The text on these slides is taken from or is adapted from one of the documents that's available as a resource, the high-level comparison between version 1 and version 2. So there's also that document you can look at if you want, that's very similar to what's on these slides. Okay, so first of all, I want to clarify, I will probably just keep referencing version 1. There's the most recent version of our standard prior to version 2 was actually a 1.1. Version 1 was published in 2010. Version 1.1 was published in 2019. But the only change that occurred in 2019 was the addition of Annex H, which is supplementary requirements for national forest. So all of the indicators that are applicable to most certificate holders, nothing changed from version 1 to version 1.1. The only change was the addition of that national forest annex. So I'm just going to say version 1, and it means both of them, but that's the way it goes. Okay. So one of the big changes is the overall structure to the standard. In version 1, there were 10 principles, but most management units only had to conform with principles 1 through 9. And principle 10 was only if your management unit had plantations within it. So the change is that moving forward, all management units have to conform with principles 1 through 10. So all of those indicators apply to all management units. There are some additional requirements for plantations that occur in various places within the standard, but all management units need to conform with 1 through 10. One of the other big changes is that in version 1, workers' rights and community relations were combined into a single principle. And now those two topics are covered in 2 separate principles. Workers' rights is covered in Principle 2. It's workers' rights and well-being. And then Principle 4 addresses local communities. One of the last ones I wanted to call out is that we've worked to kind of reduce complexity a little bit around family forest indicators. And these are indicators that are applicable to small or low intensity managed forests, i.e. SLIMPs. And in our version 1 standard, we had 3 different types of family forest indicators: low risk, alternate, and inapplicable indicators. Moving forward, we've eliminated the low risk indicators. There was actually often a lot of confusion around how actually they should be audited and applied. And we only have alternate indicators, so something slightly different for family forests, or the indicator is inapplicable for family forests. All right. And if you guys are hearing any weird noises in the background, my dog has decided to make some noise. So hopefully my husband will take care of that in the near future. Okay, next topic is dispute resolution. In version 1, there was a clear expectation that certificate holders would resolve disputes that came forward, and then there was a set of specific topics on which those disputes were explicitly or dispute resolution was explicitly required. In version 2, it's been the requirement to have a dispute resolution process has been added. Yes, you are expected to resolve disputes around particular topics, but you're expected to have a process that makes the submission of complaints easy and accessible to the folks who might be affected by these kinds of disputes. And then also the work to resolve the disputes. This is a place where the Standard Development Group actually worked on streamlining these topics related to the different types of disputes are covered in 3 different criteria and 1 indicator, and the requirements have all been combined in one place. So we've got the requirements and criteria in 1.6, but they address the expectations for criterion 2.6 and 4.6 and 1 particular indicator in Principle 3. So some work to streamline. Okay. So then, as I said, Principle 2 is now focused entirely on workers' rights and well-being. What this has meant is that there's been a change in the number of the number of indicators that are directly applicable to workers' issues. There are, I believe, 6 criteria now in Principle 2. Previously, there were some indicators in that combined community and workers principle. The definition of workers really has not changed that much, but how it's been applied has changed between version 1 and version 2. In version 1, there were some indicators that were applicable only to employees of the certificate holder, and then there were a small number that were applicable to all workers. In version 2, all of the indicators in Principle 2 are applicable to all workers, whether they are employees of the certificate holder or contractors employees. So that's really the big change. However, the Standard Development Group worked really hard to provide additional guidance around verification of conformance and wanted to make sure that it was explicitly recognized that while the indicators might be the same for all types of workers, the way that you demonstrate conformance will be different potentially for different types of workers. So this was one of the most difficult parts of the standard development for the Standard Development Group. They spent a lot of time focused on Principle 2 and addressing concerns around contractors and around the potential for misclassification of employees and the impacts from that. So really focused on this, feel pretty good about where we landed, but this is a place where we will continue to be working and to provide additional guidance. Okay, Indigenous peoples' rights and resources. I think that one of the biggest changes here is that in the version 1 standard, there was an expectation that the certificate holder consult with Indigenous peoples that hold rights. There were, clearly those rights needed to be respected, and resources needed to not be harmed as a result of management activities. Moving forward, the change is that there's a kind of higher level of expectation related to the engagement, and it's engaging with a potentially broader set of Indigenous peoples. So it's those that have rights and or those that have resources that are important to them that might be affected by management activities. So potentially a greater number of Indigenous peoples that may need to be engaged, and then across a broader set of topics. The other change is the incorporation of FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent. And this is a process of engagement and ensuring that the Indigenous peoples have given their consent for management activities that might have an impact on their legal or customary rights. So FPIC is applicable only to situations where those rights might be affected by management activities. And so it doesn't apply to all the different resources that might be of importance, but to those rights type issues. And it's about building a relationship and recognizing that the Indigenous people are not required to give their consent. They have the right to withhold consent as well. But the idea is to work on building a relationship and work on ensuring that management activities moving forward will not have a negative impact on the rights that are held by Indigenous peoples. Okay, Conservation Areas Network. We've heard a lot about this topic, a lot about both kind of the positive benefits of this new requirement, but also about kind of concerns from certificate holders about this new requirement. So in the version 1 standard, there were a lot of different indicators that actually resulted in the designation of conservation areas. Maybe an area that was designated because that was a place where there was going to be a focus on conservation of a particular rare, threatened, or endangered species, where there maybe was a particular resource of importance that needed to be buffered. So there were conservation areas as part of the version 1 standard. But moving forward, there's now an explicit threshold, and the certificate holders will be asked to designate at least 10% of the management unit as a conservation area. So a conservation area is a place where the primary purpose of that area is to conserve a particular environmental or cultural value. This doesn't mean that management activities can't occur. This doesn't mean that other activities can't occur. But it's a place where the primary purpose is to conserve a particular environmental or cultural value. We usually get asked why. Why was this added? So this was a requirement added because FSC's members recognized that there was a global movement towards, looking at what is it that's needed to help ensure the conservation of biodiversity globally. There's been a lot of concern about impacts on biodiversity from many different threats and sources. And there's been a lot of conversation around how much is enough. FSC looked, and its members looked at some of the research and some of the estimates out there. I've seen estimates as high as 50% of lands and waters should be conserved, 30%. There's a 30 by 30 goal out there. And there were some considerations for a higher number, but in the end, the decision was to go for 10%. So that's where this kind of rationale came from for including this new requirement. Okay, as we were as FSC US was wrapping up version 1 and then moving on to implementation of version 1, we almost immediately started getting comments that, climate change is such an important consideration. Moving forward, there really needs to be more incorporation of climate change considerations in the standard. So this was heard loud and clear by the standard development group. And because there are so many elements of the standard that are already resulting in and promoting climate change mitigation, the real focus during this revision was incorporating elements around climate change adaptation. The requirements kind of follow your typical climate change adaptation framework, gathering information about potential future impacts, looking at vulnerabilities, developing strategies to address those impacts and vulnerabilities, monitoring, and then adapting as needed. So this has now been incorporated in multiple places, but it really reflects a climate change adaptation framework. Okay. Mitigation and repair of environmental damage. It's a change, but it's not a change. Version 1 really implicitly required, there were a lot of places that talk about restoration, or particularly around important environmental values. And so it was implicit, if there were harms to environmental values, there was an expectation for restoration. In version 2, this is more explicit, and the requirement to mitigate negative impacts that have occurred to environmental values is explicitly stated, and actually in a number of different indicators. There is one particular indicator which takes this and expands it to consider also the potential for negative impacts on environmental values that are outside of the management unit from management activities that are occurring within the management unit. And there's also some additional consideration about harms that occurred due to activities from, previous owners or folks who have rights, within the management unit that maybe are outside of the control of the certificate holder themselves. So it's about addressing harms to environmental values, implicit in version 1, explicit in version 2. And when in monitoring, it's one of the big changes here was an increase in flexibility for certificate holders. Both version 1 and version 2 require a monitoring protocol. In version 1, there's a set of indicators that are very explicit about you must monitor these things. In version 2, there's an annex which provides a set of topics that should be considered, but then it's the certificate holder that identifies which of those are applicable, what are the things that really need to be part of this monitoring protocol. The other change for version 2 is that there is a new requirement to establish verifiable targets that are to be used to help determine whether or not management activities are being achieved as part of the overall monitoring protocol. Okay. A new change, and this is overall throughout the FSC system, is the way that FSC is looking at converted lands. Prior to the introduction of our policy to address conversion, any land that was converted to plantation, from natural forest to plantation after 1994 was not eligible for FSC certification at all. That has changed so that if lands were converted from natural forest to plantation between 94 and 2020, those lands may now be certified under two scenarios. either, it was a very limited portion of the management unit, and there's ongoing benefits from that conversion, or the certificate holder has worked through the remedy framework and has implemented restitution of social and environmental harms that resulted from that conversion. So it is now possible to certify lands that were converted after 94, before 2020, or before the end of 2020. Another kind of positive change here is the introduction of a really detailed high conservation value framework. There is a extensive annex in the standard, which provides a framework with how to go about determining what is and what isn't a high conservation value. It really, we're hoping, will help to address some of the consistency issues that we've heard. Some certificate holders feel that they've been asked to identify things that are kind of an overburden. And this, we're trying to work to level the playing field here, and to also help stakeholders understand what is and what isn't a high conservation value. This is on top of kind of a change in the framing of high conservation values. In version 1, there was a requirement to identify high conservation value forests, and then ensure that the attributes within them were maintained or enhanced. We're now kind of flipping that framing around, where the initial focus is on identifying the values themselves, and then building out to determine what is the area, the high conservation value area, on which those values define. So you're still kind of looking at two scales. One is, specific attributes or values, and then the other is the area. So there's a slightly different framing. The focus in version 2 is really on ensuring that the values themselves are maintained or enhanced. Another kind of potentially exciting change is that it is now possible to certify non-timber forest products through conformance with the Forest Stewardship Standard on its own. So previously, if you wanted to certify a non-timber forest product, I don't know what it might be. It could be spruce tips. It could be mushrooms. It could be essential oils from a particular tree. If you wanted to do that, maple syrup, that was another good one. If you wanted to do that, you had to conform with the former forest management standard. And additionally, you had to work with a certification body to have additional indicators and additional standard developed for that specific non-timber forest product. And then you had to be audited to both of them and conform with both of them. Moving forward, all you have to do is conform with the Forest Stewardship Standard. There's an extensive list of non-timber forest products that are in scope for the standard at the beginning of the standard in the preamble. And there's maybe 2 or 3 indicators that are specific to non-timber forest products within the standard itself. So we're really pretty excited that this might open up additional opportunities for increasing the value of FSC certification. Another really positive change was that we had understood that version 1 had created, just through language within the standard, had created some barriers and challenges for certification of Indigenous lands, of tribal lands. And so the standard development group worked hard to address some of the most critical language issues within. One was to focus more on using the term best available information instead of specifically scientific literature or research. And then the definition of best available information explicitly includes scientific literature, research, and traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge and also traditional experience are now incorporated into the definition of expert. So it's not just individuals who have titles or particular degrees, but experience can also lead to being an expert. And then one of the more subtle things was that tribes often consider their entire forest that they're managing a high conservation value because their community depends on that forest. And that's one of the categories of high conservation values. But it was interpreted that management activities couldn't occur within a high conservation value forest. So moving forward, there's language now explicitly incorporated in the standard to recognize that yes, other activities may occur within a high conservation value area, as long as they prevent damage and avoid risks to those values. I think there's just one left, and then we'll move to questions. So just I wanted to, we get comments about the length of the standard, and I know you'll notice that it's significantly longer than the previous standard. But the primary reason for this is that there is a lot of additional guidance. The Standard Development Group was asked to provide guidance on many different indicators. They were asked to define a lot of terms that were not defined in the previous standard. As you can see, there's a lot of annexes that have been added to provide kind of additional information, help with understanding, and just increase the guidance around different topics like representative sample areas and conservation areas network and engagement, culturally appropriate engagement with local communities and indigenous peoples. So this is one of the things that we're really happy about, is that how much extra additional guidance is being provided within the standard. And I think with that, that's the end of the topics. So we do have a poll, really quick poll that we're going to ask folks to complete. And that will give you a minute to add any questions that come up for you within the chat, if you can, or if you're dying to ask a question verbally, just raise your hand, then that's fine. But please, if you would complete the poll and then put any questions in the chat. We'll move on in a second to answering the questions in the chat. All right, 20 seconds more. Really appreciate your input. This will help us with the work that we have to do next year in 2026. 5 seconds. All right, Carly, would you close the poll, please? Okay, you can share the results, it's fine. So as you can see, we've got some clear high interest in a number of the topics: workers and labor rights, conservation areas network, high conservation values, and representative sample areas coming out kind of as sort of a top 4 there. So we'll take this into consideration. This will particularly help us as we're looking at what topic-specific webinars to offer in the first quarter of next year. So thank you very much. Okay. So then questions. I've got my chat box open, Carly, so I think you can tell me if I miss anything, but it looks like we've got a question about workers. Will state certificate holders be required to verify factors for workers who are not employed by them? So there are requirements around things like the example given there, gender equity, that would apply to non-employees in addition to employees. However, as I mentioned previously, as the Standard Development Group was working on the indicators in Principle 2, they really worked to try and find a way to ensure that there would not be any requirement to cross legal boundaries to potentially risk misclassification of employees, so that there are suggestions in the standard for how the conformance could be demonstrated by a certificate holder without asking their contractor for information that they legally can't request, or doing other kinds of activities that might put them in some kind of legal jeopardy or crossing that misclassification boundary. So yes, the indicators apply to contractors, but the Standard Development Group worked really hard to find a way to ensure that there wouldn't be a legal conflict there. And that is a place where we will continue to work on additional guidance, additional support, additional best practices or options for how a certificate holder could work through to demonstrating conformance. All right, April, yep, you got your question answered by Carly. Thank you much. NTFP. How are certificate holders expected to determine the sustainable harvest level for particular products? For instance, we've looked for research on sustainable levels of salal. So the determination of sustainable harvest levels does need to be based on best available information. So there will be obviously varying levels of information about what's appropriate. The specific indicator says you can look at sustainable harvest levels, or if there's guidance on sustainable harvesting that's available from a reputable source, then you could use that instead for determining what's a sustainable approach to harvesting non-timber forest products. Can you go over the definition of conservation areas again, and what is allowed or not allowed in conservation areas? Okay, so a conservation area, and I am paraphrasing the definition here. This is not the exact definition, but a conservation area is where the primary purpose of that area is to conserve a particular or a set of environmental values or cultural values. There is an annex, I think it's Annex H in the standard, which recognizes there's a lot of other places within the indicators of the standard which require doing exactly this. And so those kinds of areas could be used as part of the conservation areas network. There's specific language related to management, which says that you need to avoid activities that will have a negative impact on that value that is being conserved within that area. So that language is within Annex H, and that's where you would look for it. Okay, how do the standards on workers and labor rights mesh with US labor retention laws, especially with independent contractor status? As I said, the Standard Development Group tried very hard to ensure that there was not going to be a conflict with those laws. If you identify any, please let us know, and we will do what we can to work on resolving that and working with our colleagues at FSC International and with certification bodies and with ASME. What are some of the limitations with the conservation areas? Okay, it is not a set aside. Number one, I hate that term. Management decisions are needed on every chunk of land, even if the decision is to not implement any specific activity. but you just hit one of my triggers, so apologies. Conservation areas are not set-asides. There are options and the ability to implement management activities as long as they're not creating a negative impact or making it impossible to conserve the environmental or cultural value that's the focus of that conservation area. And again, I'm paraphrasing and would encourage you to go and check out draft 6, which is on the webpage, and you can look at the language in Annex H. And that's, I believe, the end of the questions. Carly, did we end up having anyone who raised their hand or anything like that that we should recognize?
Not that I saw. I got a couple of private messages. We can share this presentation with participants, right? We'll be able to share.
I believe that will happen automatically. Sean indicated that a link to the recording and I believe a link to the slides themselves will be sent to each individual who registered for the webinar.
Great.
Okay, so
I just shared a link to our webpage that has those resources available, including
perfect.
a copy of the standard.
All right, really appreciate it. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you all who participated in this revision process. We're looking forward to continuing to work with you moving forward and looking at as smooth an implementation of the new standard as we can. Carly and I want to support you all as much as we can. So thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting us. And we look forward to working with you moving forward. All right, appreciate it. Okay, Carly, can you stop the recording, please? Okay, awesome.